And now we will move on to session 3. It's titled Data Governance and Policy. As we embark on the journey of MyData industry, we will discuss digital economy policies in finance, transportation, and healthcare, among others, hear from industry stakeholders, introduce overseas cases, and explore ways to secure data competitiveness. Let me introduce the panelists and the moderator. As the moderator, we have Professor Yu Byung-jun of Business Administration at SNU, Policy Coordination and Planning Officer of MOEF, Jae-won Kim, and also Jung-hee Shin, Head of Project Development at Viva Republica, and also Jade Nestor, Head of Public Data Policy at TikTok, is joining us online. Now, I will pass the mic to the moderator.
예, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be moderating session 3 of today's forum. My name is Yu Byung-jun from SNU. So I would like to ask the speakers, the panelists, to introduce themselves very briefly. So why don't we go with Mr. Kim first, and then Mr. Shin, and then Jade. So the topic of this session is data governance and policy. And of course, I think it's one of the key pillars of digital economy. Data is the new gold. And we sometimes call this economy data economy. So we compare this to oil in the age of industrial revolution. And as I said, we compare data to oil. So we have to understand how we need to deal with this very important asset. We need the proper guidance and policy to deal with data. So as we have many people with us today, not all of them are data experts. So we will talk about the policy and governance of data. But from your own position, can you please introduce yourself and what you do in terms of data governance and policy? Why don't you go first, Mr. Kim? Yes. Hello, my name is Kim Jae-hwan. So what we do at MOEF, we oversee all the economic activities and financial activities in Korea. So we work with the Information Agency as well as the Ministry of Administration and other ministries such as Ministry of ICT to improve data control and data governance. And our focus of interest is how to create more efficient data to deliver that to the consumers. And secondly, we also focus on data privacy, the protection of privacy, and striking a balance between privacy and data efficiency. So it's about using data more efficiently while making sure that my data is being protected. So we are attempting to design policies around that. Yes, thank you very much. Now over to you.
저는
Hello, I am Head of Project Development at Viva Republica, which is providing a service called TAS. First of all, thank you so much for your invitation. It's an honor to join you today. Our focus is, as MyData becomes part of the legislation, the MyData services on TOS have to be launched in the most stable and secure manner. And also in line with the changing laws and regulations, we will have to work closely with the government as well as regulatory authorities. From our point of view, the focus in terms of MyData initiative is that we will have to redesign user experiences, and we have to maximize the convenience for our users based on MyData initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Jade.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Jade Nestor. I am the head of Data Public Policy Europe for TikTok. I work on privacy and security public policy generally, but I'm also looking into a number of other related issues that we'll discuss today, such as personal data management and governance, data portability, and other ways to leverage data and steward data responsibly. So very excited to join you on behalf of TikTok and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, let us look at some of the issues that we have. First, the Korean issue. So, especially the financial service was planning to kick off the MyData service. However, it delayed the schedule by 4 months because the license holders would need more time to test all the samples to get ready for the project. And this is the first of its kind globally, and Korea was leading this initiative, so we need more time to prepare. So now my question goes to Mr. Shin. So as a company that prepares for MyData service, what are some of the challenges and what should be improved going forward?
네,
Yes. From the service provider's point of view, the delay in the launch of MyData project is actually not entirely negative because, as you mentioned earlier, we were able to carry out multiple sample tests, and I think that the verification is of absolute necessity before we actually launch MyData-based services. Because this is an entirely new project and initiative, we want to make sure that this is beneficial from the user's point of view. So I believe that the FSC's decision to delay the launch of MyData project is quite positive in that it will allow us to begin our service more securely and more stably. As for the challenges that we face, the government policy direction of designating the government as the entity with stewardship for data and private companies providing related services, I think it's a great direction. However, there are also challenges for TOS as well as other MyData project service providers because we have been providing these related services even before MyData project, and now we have to actually redesign existing services depending on the changing laws and regulations in response to MyData project. And we do not want to create any negative disparity in terms of user experiences. To give you some examples, as I read in the media, and as I know from my experience, in MyData project guideline, it's actually limited for the youth to make use of the services or experience the services. At the moment, we provide our existing services to the youth, and now they could have limited access to the services because of MyData project. But I did read in the media that the authorities are reconsidering this limitation, and we welcome that. Also, another challenge is that there are so many different consent procedures which will entail MyData project, and we have to embed these consent procedures in our services in the most organic and natural manner. And this will also have to be an important consideration as we reinvigorate our services based on MyData project.
수업을 할 수 있는
Yes, so the service itself can be quite flexible. So it's about personal data, and we need to make some adjustments in terms of regulation and laws. So I think the government needs to be more flexible with its approach so that the business sector can do its job as well. Now, moving on to Mr. Kim from MOF. So MyData project is a part of the many new policies that the government has introduced. And what are you focused on going forward? Well, we announced the Digital New Deal last year to advance the data industry and to really accelerate the convergence with 5G and data. So it entails everything, from storage to delivery of data. And we currently carry out many different projects. And so by 2025, we wanted to inject 6.4 trillion won into this project. And we want to bring together the public and private sector to make sure that we accumulate the data and we disclose the data. So we want to disclose about 14 million data by 2025. And when it comes to the NTS data, such as tax payment, as well as the business providers' information, we also want to disclose such information to make it available to the public. And secondly, to promote data distribution, we have adopted many different digital platforms, and we are providing support to those platforms. So it supports the entire cycle. We have 16 projects that support such projects. And we want to increase the number of such projects as well. And we want to make sure that all the application are linked, and that the users can have a single view of all the different applications. So we want to provide a map about that. And next, of course, we have to connect this to AI. So AI learning for imaging and text. So we have about 1,300 types of different services that includes about 16,000 data. So that's quite broad, and we are very keen to what the ministry plans to do. But then, my concern is that it has to have value, for usage for the users. So now moving on to the data privacy issues. Now, as we discuss data privacy, data issues, we have to talk about data privacy. And Europe has the strictest regulation, and Korea relies on the EU regulation very much. And of course, Europe focuses very much on the protection of privacy, but the US is more about it takes a different opinion. And since Jade, you worked in the U.S. government, and you also you are in charge of TikTok Global, I'm sure that you know about the different perspectives between the EU and the U.S. because the U.S. it's more about surveillance rather than protection of privacy. So it's been 3 years since the adoption of GDPR. So what would be the biggest change that have been brought about with GDPR, and how will that affect the digital economy going forward?
Thank you for that question. EU privacy law has really been influential for a long time. It's based on the Fair Information Practice Principles, which originated in the 70s and early 80s, and then were notably advanced globally through the OECD guidelines on the protection of privacy and transborder flows of data. The privacy principles from those OECD guidelines still lie at the heart of the GDPR and of the Data Protection Directive before it. And this also underlies that privacy best practices globally. Particularly after the passage of the GDPR, we've seen a proliferation of new privacy regulations around the world that reflect elements of the GDPR. And that's very good for creating interoperability between frameworks. And you mentioned, for example, the Korean law being similar in some ways to the European law, and I see this as related. In terms of the most significant changes related to privacy and also how the GDPR will continue to evolve, one interesting thing we've seen is how transparency and accountability, which are important principles in the GDPR, are emerging as important topics in other legislative proposals in Europe, including the AI regulation. Personally, I think it will be interesting to see how policymakers navigate alignment of these different regulations with similar obligations. There might be some potential overlap, and how will regulators figure out jurisdiction and enforcement for these different transparency requirements across different laws, different regulators. At TikTok, we recognize the importance of transparency for our users and for the broader stakeholder community. And in light of that, we opened a Transparency and Accountability Center in the US last year, and we're proud to announce a new Transparency and Accountability Center in Ireland this year, which unfortunately is a virtual transparency and accountability center at the moment, but will be open for physical tours hopefully next year. During tours at the Transparency and Accountability Center, government officials, media, and other stakeholders will be able to ask us direct questions. And during physical tours, when we open finally, people will be able to inspect our code in a secure environment. So we're excited about that. And further, in the spirit of transparency, we've also been putting out what was called a transparency reports, and now our quarterly reports are called community guidelines enforcement reports. And these include a growing number of categories of information. And as we've evolved the report, we've aimed to push the entire industry forward when it comes to transparency and accountability, particularly around user safety. For example, to bring more visibility to what we do to protect minors on the platform. Starting in June of this year, we added the number of accounts removed from the full TikTok experience for potentially belonging to an underage person. So there's a number of users that we pulled from the platform that's included in that report. And that builds on our previous work to strengthen default privacy settings for teens and to offer parents and teenagers tools to better manage their information and to limit features like direct messaging for them. As we look ahead, we'll continue to identify new ways to protect users, but also to provide enhanced transparency and accountability for all of our stakeholders.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
역시 아무래도
Yes, so GDPR is the leading regulatory framework which provides much guidance to other countries. And you talked about transparency and accountability, and I thought that was quite interesting. And GDPR provides guidance on those two elements as well. And alignment between laws and regulations. So consistency per se would be quite important, and having a consistent guideline would also be important for other countries to follow suit. So I think we have to learn a lot from GDPR. Well, the principles will be pretty much the same, but I hope that we can learn the good side of GDPR. And well, you worked in the US and Europe, so from your perspective, I'm sure that you see the pros and cons, of the two continents, from the US regulatory framework and the EU framework. Do you see any pros and cons between the two so that we can learn from that?
It's an interesting question. Because the U.S. government has had a privacy law for a long time. Federal privacy law has been in place since the 1970s. And in the U.S., they were promoting fair information practice principles very early. Privacy policies were encouraged since the 80s. So in a way, there was a mature operationalizing of privacy in the US quite early, and Federal Trade Commission enforcement has been quite strong. So for a long time, arguably, privacy was quite robust in the US, but you didn't have an overarching omnibus privacy law. I would say when I was in government back during the Obama administration, we did try to put together some legislative frameworks to advance, and that was in the Obama administration's Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, and other legislative proposals were made at that time. Unfortunately, there have been a number of interesting proposals, but no agreement has been reached, and that's been about a 10-year period where no agreement has been reached. So I would say that the US is still very committed to privacy and for companies to put responsible frameworks in place. But I think there has been a lot of frustration that they haven't been able to put a national law in place, particularly amongst privacy stakeholders. And on the EU side, there's been a mature framework for a long time. I think in terms of compatibility between frameworks, like you were mentioning, the EU has become more forward-thinking about interoperability between frameworks. With the GDPR, they solidified a number of mechanisms for cross-border data flows. When I was in the government, that was something that we were looking at a lot, like how we could build accountability mechanisms to be able to protect data as it transferred across borders. And we see that the EU focuses on that through ideas like codes of conduct for cross-border data flows, and of course, binding corporate rules and standard contractual clauses. Those are also mechanisms that are mentioned. And of course, adequacy, which now Korea is on the cusp of getting adequacy approved by all parties, which I think is very exciting. I mean, when I was in the government, that was something that people were thinking about. They were forecasting that for the future. So it's very exciting to see that actually happening. And it's also very exciting to see that happening after the European Court of Justice Schrems II case came out, which looked at US practices and criticized those practices, saying that without additional safeguards, that those US privacy practices might not be sufficient to protect EU user data. So to see Korea on the cusp of adequacy after all of that scrutiny of national practices in the US, I think is very exciting. And the Schrems II case with the Court of Justice does create some tension in terms of the need to transfer data, but also these limitations on maybe being able to transfer data because of perceived risk. So the EU is putting guidelines in place through the European Data Protection Board to be able to create pathways for data flows and also to articulate safeguards that need to be applied to data. I think in terms of the overarching differences, the main crux is that you can't just have a law, you need to have robust enforcement to match the law. I think that is something we see internationally. And when I was in the government, any sort of way that different governments could talk to each other and try to identify commonalities in their frameworks is always the best start to building international compatibility. So we'll look forward to seeing more initiatives like that so that we can respect the different imperatives that governments have, for example, data sovereignty initiatives, while also making sure that we don't create digital islands where data can't flow across borders. Every company, I think, is grappling with how to do that and trying to work with governments to resolve it.
감사합니다. 제가 추가 질문하면서 이제 또 질문.
Yes, thank you very much for that. That actually served as a perfect segue to my next question because I wanted to ask something about data transfer. But anyways, GDPR tells us that we need to align our regulations and laws. So we need to be aligned, stay aligned, and examine closely what happens. Now, moving on to the next question. So we've heard from Europe and the US, but what about the Korean policies? What do we need to do better and what are we doing well? So if you were to self-assess, well, actually, Korea is very keen about data protection, and we make sure that we go through consent from the users. And we talked about GDPR, but Korea also receives evaluation about the adequacy for its data privacy level. And that means that Korea's level of data privacy protection is quite similar to that of the EU. So that should be our precondition. And of course, we have to use data quite wisely. So we enacted the Data 3 Act last year, and that led to the kickoff of MyData service. So we need to adopt more policies that promote data protection. So we try to stay aligned to that. And we also have Data Dam initiative that the Korean government recently launched. And under that initiative, we have many small programs that we have rolled out for the small and medium-sized enterprises as well. And actually, AI providers have increased from 220 to 900 or so, and the data providers from 2,100 to much more. So about 10% of all the data that we have started to be accumulated. So we want to build the right data capacity and really promote data as a standalone sector. So that itself is quite significant. But from the institutional point of view, of course, I talked about MyData service as well as the Data 3 Act, but we are still taking baby steps. It's still in the early phase, and we'll go through many trials and errors. So we have to really, use other benchmarks to do better. And now we have Data Privacy Act that covers everything. But we need to have a basic framework act on data so that it can regulate specific areas. At the end of the day, we have to deliver data to those who demand such data, the users, but we cannot deliver trash. So we have to provide quality data. So big data platforms and AI learning tools are some of the initiatives that we are currently examining, and we are paying our attention to the voice of the users as well. Yes, you talked about the Data 3 Act and the Framework Act on data. Of course, we need to enact or revise existing laws. So I do understand that the Korean government is taking bold steps in that aspect, but I'm sure that users, have something to say. So, Mr. Shin, would you like to say something about that?
께서 말씀 주신
Yes, the government's policy as well as the legislation of the three data laws mentioned by the officer, it's a direction that we all welcome from the businesses as well. But from MyData project's point of view, I would like to add a couple of comments in terms of vitalizing the use and management of user data. From the business's point of view, in order to actually promote the utilization of such data, when you have a lot of MyData service providers in the market, it's very important to actually persuade the public to use these services themselves. It's difficult to persuade them about the benefits of these services. That's how we can expand the market. And from that point of view, I think there is a room for improvement in the existing MyData project, because at the moment it has the limitations in terms of acquiring more service providers to actually increase the penetration rate. In order for a business to be registered as a MyData service provider, there are so many different procedures that you have to go through. I mean, from our point of view, we were registered from an early stage, so we don't have to go through all the procedures. But for the companies that are just beginning this journey of MyData project, they have to go through a lot of hassle in registering themselves, and that could be a barrier for many of them. And also, in terms of MyData project, there are a lot of other stakeholders like financial service providers, which provide API in order to respond to the privacy requirements of the MyData project. And therefore, when individuals or MyData service providers use these APIs, for example, it means more cost. And therefore, the users will feel hesitant about using the data services, and this could actually slow down the development of this project. And in order to securely establish the project, the government did introduce a grace period of a year where you don't have to actually pay this cost. But I think there are still barriers which have to be broken down, especially for the users. The user shouldn't have to pay anything to use MyData services, or maybe the government could provide subsidies to encourage more users to take part in the project.
뭐
Yes, thank you very much for that. So you talked about the registration eligibility, the hassle that the businesses have to go through, and TOS is, of course, quite large in terms of its size, but of course we also need transaction mechanism, which is quite costly. So of course the government cannot support all the different companies, but it needs to support infrastructure as well as other elements as well, because we have to promote the market itself and expand the market itself. So we will look forward to your support. So this is another question that I wanted to ask. So data scientist Dr. Kathy O'Neill gave the second keynote speech, and she talked about what can go wrong with AI, and she talked about biased algorithm, and big data can actually deepen inequality, and that we can fall into the trap of generalization. And she also talked about the flaws of measurement. So of course, from businesses' point of view, we need to have unflawed algorithm, and we need to make sure that we do not fall into the trap of generalization. So now, what are your thoughts on this, Jade?
So, in my previous experience when I was in the government, I worked on the Obama administration's big data review. And in that context, the group identified how decisions related to things like insurance and financial services can impact people. And Kathy O'Neill mentioned this, how are algorithms impacting people? I think this is a really important area, particularly for those type of sectors where life-changing decisions are being made about people. In the EU, the GDPR has built-in requirements around automated decision-making in these types of areas, where there would be a legal or similarly significant effect on an individual. So that establishes a certain criteria for these types of decisions. But this is an area where thinking continues to evolve. Other legislative proposals are also looking at it. So I think we're going to see a lot more review of this area, both in terms of sector-specific regulation and then some overarching regulation. So continue to watch this space, particularly in Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What about you, Mr. Shin, from the perspective of private sector?
Yes, as a company that makes a heavy use of data, one of our focus is instead of intentionally influencing consumer choices using algorithms, we want to actually help consumers make informed choices. And we have this good intention of using algorithms which can help consumers make their best decisions based on the best information that's available to them. And as MyData project begins in earnest in the financial industry, they will have to really think about the impact of algorithms carefully. And I think the government policies are moving toward a direction of promoting healthier use of algorithms. For instance, we are currently providing a service where the users can compare different loan products, and we use an algorithm which has been pre-approved by the government because it actually shows the information to the consumers without any biased filters.
또 정부의 노력에
Yes. So you said that you understand the efforts of the government. And what about you, Mr. Kim, since you're from the public sector? Well, of course, we have to be careful about using data in the proper manner, because otherwise we have seen many flaws and errors that can be caused by algorithms. But we have to minimize the risks anyway. And in May, we actually announced an implementation strategy for AI so that we can guarantee reliability of AI, or it's about the algorithm guaranteeing system. So it's about really developing very detailed policies and plans for AI. And as I mentioned, we have the privacy law, which is pending at the National Assembly in Korea. And of course, when it comes to AI, which makes automatic decision, while humans need to have the right to decline the use of AI. So under the new law, humans will be able to, and we will be able to minimize the risk posed by AI automation. And when it comes to AI and algorithms, we need to study more about its side effects and its benefits. But anyway, we will do so to provide the right framework to protect our consumers and users. Yes, of course, we need to use the solution, but at the same time, we need to carefully examine its advantages and disadvantages. Since we are joined by many experts, we have many interesting questions on YouTube. Well, this is quite tricky. It's a question for TikTok. It's a global service. So I think this person saw it on TechCrunch. So biometrics data is being collected by TikTok, and I believe that is too much of a data that you are collecting. So of course, this is a very important data, but what would be your take on this? I think many people are interested in what TikTok is doing. So Jade?
Sure. So to clarify, that change referring to biometrics was in the U.S. Privacy policy. That was a change that we made to the U.S., and there were no updates that were made to the EU privacy policy. And we periodically review and update the privacy policies to reflect current practices in the relevant markets. And I represent the EU. So just to be clear, that's one distinction. And in the European context, to clarify, we don't undertake processing of biometric data. And there's a few things to consider on this, and that we need to think about when one refers to biometric data, it has a very specific meaning in a European context, and that can differ from the laws of other countries, including some in the US. And the GDPR has very specific criteria for when data is considered biometric data. So in the European context, we're not actually processing that, and I can't speak to the other changes in the other privacy policy, actually.
네, 원칙적인 내용
Yes, thank you very much. And we have received more questions. I think this is more of a case. So this person had an X-ray photography in a hospital and then went to another hospital to get a second opinion. And are there any ways to boost the convenience of the patients? I mean, I also experienced this. I actually had X-ray, and that I had to get a second referral, a second opinion. So can you please talk about this user convenience and data protection of the patients? So it's the two conflicting together.
Well, from our point of view, at the moment, we do not handle any medical data or healthcare data, so I may not be able to give you an accurate answer to the question. But in terms of this dilemma between data protection and convenience, I think that what's the most important thing to consider is we have to ensure safe processing of the data. We need the foundation for safe processing of the data. And as far as I know, in the healthcare sector, this foundation has not been established yet. And so data transfer between hospitals, as far as I know, is still risky. We need institutional measures to secure safety in that respect. And I'm sure that the government will support encryption technologies and other tools to actually lay the foundation for safe and secure processing of the data.
이게 좀 이런
So I think what this person wanted to say was this. So data privacy. So under data privacy, businesses will try to make sure that the data is not released. But then, from the patient or user point of view, that person may want his or her data because of convenience. So I think that's an issue pertinent to MyData service as well. So it's a conflict between the two. So let's say you have this data, and how much are you willing to disclose such data? So do you have any principles? So up to what level will you disclose the data? So I think it entails different factors such as cost and other elements as well. So up to what will you process the data, and up to what will you disclose? How much? So in terms of raw data and structure of the data and processing the data, I'm sure that these are topics that we will discuss much more once MyData is released. So, so from TOS perspective, up to what level are you willing to disclose or use?
네, 이 부분은
In that respect, I may not be in the best position to answer the question, but to do my best. Regarding information requested by the party that the information belongs to, of course, we will provide the information. And let's say in the financial sector, there's transaction data, and it should be provided to the transaction parties, and that is the existing structure of MyData project. But for example, let's say that a company used personal data to analyze it and process it to generate certain results, then that kind of process data would be provided according to the different purposes of the different companies.
이제 오프닝
So transactional data will be disclosed, you said. So what about structure of the data? So since you have your own platform, I have a question to Mr. Kim. So we talked about transactional data here, but then because of Data Protection Act, sometimes users may want to have such data, but it may not be allowed because of the law. So do you have a plan for that, or like a criteria for that? Well, about MyData and data flow, of course, if the users want to receive such data, we want to provide such data and information to the users. But we take a phased approach. So at the financial sector, we wanted to kick off MyData with the 3 Data Act last year, but then that's been delayed. For the healthcare sector, we will introduce MyData service, but it will be done in a slow manner because we have to be careful. So we gather data from different websites and mobile webs, but then that still has limitations. And of course, we still have risk of data leakage, especially if data is leaked overseas. So that is why we are pursuing policies that can prevent that. At the same time, we want to scale MyData service up to the entire population. So by the end of this year, we will launch the service, and we will be careful to look at what happens in the process to devise the next step. But then, of course, we have to be able to use the data, but on the other side, we have to protect the data. So we need to strike a balance between the two. And so at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we respect and protect privacy, but release and disclose information. And that's very challenging. So that's why we have introduced the concept of unidentifiable information. So that will actually serve as a benchmark, whether it is identifiable or not, how much we will disclose the data. Yes, thank you very much for that. I think this is a very interesting session. And I heard that Mr. Kim has to leave soon because he has another commitment. So I have one question left. So before you go, Mr. Kim, anything else that you would like to say about government policy as a closing remark? Well, with respect to the institutions, of course, we have to protect data. That is the precondition. And we will make sure to promote the usage of data for the data economy so that we foster the data sector, at the same time protect privacy. And the private sector and the public sector will need to reach consensus on many topics, and I will make sure to listen to the ideas from the private sector as well as the public, so that the 3 actors can reach consensus at the end of the day. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Kim. So you may go. Thank you. So I have one final question to Mr. Shin and Ms. Nestor. So we are talking about government policy and governance. And TOS is a leading actor in Korea, and TikTok is a global company in this area as well. But then, of course, we talked about structure and cost model. But, how can we generate revenue with data only? Because you have provided services with data at its core. But from the business point of view, how important is data? How much revenue do you plan to generate from data? and any plans that you have, any future plans that you have for data and data services. So of course, don't disclose any trade secrets, but please tell us any plans that you have for the future. Mr. Shin?
네, 우선
In the case of our company, in terms of generating revenues using data, we are almost only solely focused on creating user experience through data. So actually selling raw data for money and expanding our business on that front is not something that we are considering at the moment. We're more focused on providing a user experience based on data. Okay.
하셨잖아요. 그럼 가공
So you talked about the processing cost. So will it compensate such cost? Will that be the pricing of the data?
외부의 데이터를
In terms of providing our data to an external party, we currently do not set any price for the data. And under my project, we will then become an information service provider, and we will have to provide some financial data. And that's how far we got so far. We do not actually have any plan for selling the data that we process to a third party. Okay, what about in TikTok? I think it could be slightly different for you. I know that Facebook actually reaps in a lot of profits through data by actually trading data. And what about TikTok? Do you have any business direction in terms of generating revenue using data? So do you have any plans for data projects?
Well, as an entertainment platform, which is really what we consider ourselves, we have to process data to provide services. So that's a very basic level. But I think for our user community and our platform to thrive, that there just needs to be trust underlying the system. And that means that we need to be transparent and accountable to our users and continue to have dialogues with our users about what trust means to them, what privacy and security mean to them. That's something that we've been doing in the EU, for example, through focus groups and also partnerships with NGOs to try to figure out how to communicate data practices and privacy practices to our users and find out what's important to them. I think as an entertainment platform, as I mentioned, we've seen all of us globally such big changes in the entertainment world, exciting opportunities. And I think TikTok's going to continue to innovate in that space and also have other types of related offerings to try to expand, still staying a place where our users can creatively express themselves, but then just offering more options and more experiences. So yeah, data will continue to be critical to that experience, but we're always trying to put the privacy and security of that user data first and foremost as we innovate.
제가 좀 어려운 질문 드렸나 봐요. 상당히
Yes, that was a very tough question, I think, but thank you very much for that answer. So last but not least, from the business perspective, as we are talking about business policy and you are leading your own teams, any final comments that you would like to say? Anything that you would like to say to the audience? Mr. Shin, do you have anything to say to the audience?
네, 우선
Yes, first of all, this was a very meaningful session for me. It was an opportunity to hear a case of a global company as well as about the government policies. As a financial service platform, we stay committed to make sure that we provide a great user experience based on financial data. That has always been our focus and it will continue to be our focus. Especially if you think about the financial sector in Korea, it's actually been quite a difficult environment to acquire and utilize user data related to finance. And I think TOS played its role in innovating the market to provide better benefits for the users. And we will continue to work hard to this end. And the foundation of all of this is data security and data platform. And we will do our best. I see. So
서비스에
We need to provide service that is useful to the users, and that is actually the essence of data provision, and you will be faithful to that.
예, 한국에 우리
So, to the Korean audience, do you have maybe a concluding remark?
I think for me personally, I'm quite excited to see what happens with the Korean data initiatives, with MyData, for example. I think in terms of advanced thinking on data, I know that the Korean government's been doing a lot. I mean, if you look even at the experience during COVID-19, there's been a lot of discussion about innovative data use in Korea, and the fact that that can be reconciled with a robust privacy law is a very good case study for the rest of the world, to see how privacy regulation is not hindering innovation, that you have to continue to think about how to protect data in different circumstances, but that it is possible, and trust and accountability have to underlie that system, both for governments and for the private sector.
네, 감사합니다. 오늘 이 좋은
Yes, thank you very much for that. It was a great honor to discuss about this very important topic, and thank you very much, Jade and Mr. Shin. It was great to hear about TikTok and TOS, as well as what we're doing in Korea in terms of data policy and governance. But at the end of the day, I think that users matter the most when it comes to data. So from a user perspective, we need to create and generate data that can create synergy, and we need to be able to control data in that manner. So of course, when it comes to MyData, we talk about how the extent of data usage so far. We have actually used data quite extensively, but then from now on, it's more about the synergy that we can create with data, which is pertinent to the dilemma between privacy and data usage. And of course, we need to be able to generate useful data for the users by striking a balance between the two. And as all the panelists mentioned, well, I think that this is a new for everyone, and the MyData service is the first of its kind in Korea as well. So I wish the success of the service so that it can provide guidance for other countries as well. Anyways, we heard from the private as well as public sector, and I got the impression that all the sectors are well prepared for data governance and policy, and I'm sure that the audience agrees with me. So thank you very much for your insightful opinions, and thank you very much for your contribution. I'm sure that it will help us pave a stronger way forward. Thank you very much for that.
번째 세션의 갈무리까지 완벽하게
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the moderator and the panelists in session 3. Now we have one last session left for the Digital Economy Forum. For those of you who have been with us throughout the day, I'm sure that you acquired a lot of insight on the digital economy, and I'm sure that session 4 can add to the insight. Before we begin session 4, I would like to give you a brief announcement about the event. We continue to receive answers on the quiz event in the chat room. For those of you who joined us just now, You will see the quiz question on the screen. And if you know the answer, please write the answer, the name, and the last four numbers of your phone number. To the winners, we will present you with prizes. If you want to know if you're the winner, then please stay with us until the very end of the forum. At the end of the forum, we will announce the winners of the event. So I look forward to having you with us until the very end of the forum.